On the night of November 2nd, 1907, the most powerful bankers in America could not leave a room. The door to J.P. Morgan's library had been locked from the outside. Morgan had summoned them to East 36th Street. He had not asked. The men inside controlled more combined capital than the United States Treasury, and none of them left until he said so. The question isn't whether Morgan had the nerve. The question is why it worked, and why 10 minutes from now, you'll see the single sentence in the congressional record that explains why it could never work again. To understand the autumn of 1907, you need to understand what the United States did not have. It had no central bank. The second bank of the United States had been killed by Andrew Jackson in 1836, and in the 70 years since, Congress had never replaced it. What the country had instead was a patchwork: nationally chartered banks, state-chartered banks, and a rapidly expanding category of institution called trust companies, which were regulated far more loosely than commercial banks and held no requirement to maintain the same reserve cushions against their deposits. That looseness was not an oversight. It was the point. By 1907, New York's trust companies held deposits of nearly $1 billion combined. They had grown by lending aggressively into a market that was, by almost every indicator, dangerously extended. Copper speculation was the specific accelerant that autumn. A syndicate led by F. Augustus Heinze and Charles W. Morse had attempted to corner the stock of United Copper Company. On October 14th, the corner collapsed. Within 48 hours, Heinze's Mercantile National Bank faced a depositor run. Within 4 days, that run had spread by association, real or rumored, to any institution whose officers had touched the Heinze or Morse network. The contagion mechanism here was not unique to 1907. It is almost always the same. In the absence of a credible backstop, rational depositors in an adjacent institution have no reason to wait and every reason to run first. The word panic makes it sound irrational. It was not irrational. It was a correct individual response to a collective problem that no individual had the incentive to solve. The vocabulary of hysteria has served for more than a century to obscure that clarity. Except in this case, one did. The Knickerbocker Trust Company occupied a limestone building on 5th Avenue and 34th Street. And in October 1907, it was the third largest trust company in New York, with deposits of approximately $62 million. Its president, Charles T. Barney, was a well-connected man, connected, unfortunately, to Charles Morse, whose financial wreckage was now spreading through the system. In the language of contagion, Barney's connection to Morse was not a fact. It was enough to be a rumor. In about 3 minutes, we'll look at the single overnight examination report that determined whether any of those $62 million could be saved. And the one word in that report that changed everything. On October 21st, the National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear checks for the Knickerbocker. That announcement was not a regulatory finding. It was not a government action. It was a private decision by one institution to distance itself from another. And it was, in effect, a public declaration that the Knickerbocker was suspect. In the absence of any authority capable of contradicting that signal, it was the only signal that mattered. The next morning, October 22nd, depositors began forming a line before the Knickerbocker's doors opened. By 11 o'clock that morning, the Knickerbocker had paid out approximately $8 million. At noon, it suspended payments entirely. The run had taken less than 3 hours. Charles Barney resigned. He would shoot himself 6 weeks later. The historical record does not say whether he believed he could have been saved, or whether he understood that by the time Morgan's people looked at the Knickerbocker's books and found them inadequate, his institution was already beyond the scope of any rescue. What the record does say is that the examination happened, the verdict was delivered, and no help came. Barney was left to draw his own conclusions. Morgan was 70 years old that autumn, not in the best of health, and he had been in Richmond, Virginia, attending an Episcopal convention when the news reached him. His private rail car brought him back to New York overnight. By the morning of October 19th, he was in his library on 36th Street, surrounded by financial statements, with a rotating cast of bankers coming through the door to brief him on what was collapsing next. No government had asked him to come. No law required it. He simply came. What Morgan understood, and what made him uniquely capable of acting, was that the crisis was not yet about solvency. It was about liquidity. Most of the threatened institutions held real assets. What they lacked was cash available at the speed the panic demanded. If cash could be deployed quickly enough and visibly enough, the psychology of the run could be reversed. That was the theory. The question was whether anyone had both the resources and the personal authority to make it hold. After the Knickerbocker fell, the next institution under pressure was the Trust Company of America on Wall Street. Its president, Oakley Thorne, went to see Morgan on October 22nd. The same day, the Knickerbocker suspended payments. The question Morgan needed answered was the one he applied to every institution that came to him during those 2 weeks. Is this solvent, or is it merely illiquid? The answer would determine whether rescue was possible or whether the fire was already past containing. The distinction mattered enormously. A bank that is illiquid can be saved by a loan. A bank that is insolvent cannot. Or at least, saving it requires accepting losses that someone must first agree to absorb. Morgan sent his people to examine the Trust Company of America's books overnight. The examination ran until early morning. The verdict, delivered to Morgan before dawn, was that the institution was, in his associate's judgment, solvent. Everything that followed depended on that single word. And in about 4 minutes, you'll see exactly what Morgan did with that verdict. Inside a room that some of the men present would later refuse to describe, and one of them would describe only once. Morgan's reported response has been cited by Ron Chernow in his 1990 biography of the Morgan firm. It is worth the exact words. This, then, is the place to stop the trouble. Over the following days, Morgan organized successive tranches of emergency lending to the Trust Company of America. He persuaded John D. Rockefeller to deposit $10 million in the Union Trust Company to demonstrate confidence. He worked with Treasury Secretary George B. Cortelyou to channel $25 million in federal deposits into New York banks, one of the few direct government interventions of the crisis, and a notably modest one given the scale of the problem. Everything else was Morgan's own construction, held together by his word. None of this was a system. It was a series of improvised decisions made by one aging man in a private library, mediated through personal relationships, dependent entirely on whether other bankers trusted Morgan's judgment enough to follow his lead. And most of the time, that autumn, they did. That was the problem. It worked. If you find yourself watching a channel dedicated to the mechanics of the things that broke the financial world, and you'd like it to keep going, subscribing is how that works. By the 1st of November, the crisis had moved into its most dangerous phase. The stock market was surviving only because Morgan had personally organized a pool of money, assembled in his library on October 24th, in 22 minutes, according to most contemporary accounts, to lend to brokers at 10% interest and prevent a complete seizure of exchange trading. Now, a new problem had emerged, and this one had no obvious solution that did not require the men most reluctant to provide it. The New York trust companies, still under pressure, needed a coordinated rescue fund of their own. The trust companies, however, were competing institutions, and their presidents had every incentive to free ride, to accept the stabilization that others' contributions would purchase while committing nothing themselves. The logic was airtight. The consequences, if everyone followed it, were catastrophic. Morgan solved this problem the way he solved most problems, by removing the option of delay. On the evening of November 2nd, he invited, the word invited requires some qualification, the presidents of the major trust companies to his library. The library itself was not a neutral venue. Morgan had built it as a monument to his own taste and accumulated power. It held his art collection, his manuscripts, his incunabula. It was, physically and symbolically, his room. Walking into it was, in some sense, already an answer. The bankers arrived. Morgan's associates, among them Benjamin Strong, then a junior Morgan partner and later the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had prepared a subscription agreement. The trust company presidents were asked to sign, committing their institutions to a rescue fund of approximately $25 million. They were asked politely. For now, they did not immediately sign. The hours passed. Morgan moved between rooms. He played solitaire at a small table in the corner. This detail appears in multiple contemporary accounts, including the recollection of Morgan's son-in-law, Herbert Satterley, while the bankers debated in the main hall. At some point after midnight, when it became clear that the group was still deadlocked, Morgan entered the room. What happened next is the most cited scene in the history of the 1907 panic. Morgan placed the subscription agreement on the table and told the assembled men that the money must be pledged before any of them left. Then he stood, or sat, accounts vary, and waited. By 4:30 in the morning, the fund was subscribed. The trust company president signed. Some accounts say the door had been locked. Morgan's own associates never confirmed this detail, and Satterley's contemporaneous memoir does not include it. What is not disputed is that Morgan made it clear, through presence, through silence, through the weight of 70 years of accumulated authority, that leaving without signing was not a realistic option. Whether the door was locked or not may be beside the point. The men inside had already understood that it was. Near the end of this video, we'll see the one document from that night that does survive, the commitment sheet, and the total figure written at the bottom that those men agreed to absorb before any of them left the room. The panic of 1907 subsided over November and into December. The credit markets stabilized. The stock exchange did not collapse. The cascade of trust company failures stopped at a containable number. By any reasonable measure, Morgan's intervention had worked. And in working, it had revealed something that no one in Washington could comfortably ignore. But here is where it gets stranger, because the success of the rescue was immediately understood by serious people on all sides of the debate as an argument not for Morgan, but against him. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, watched the crisis unfold and drew a specific conclusion. The United States could not build a financial system around the assumption that J.P. Morgan would always be present, always be willing, and always be trusted by the men in the room. Morgan was past 70. He would be dead within 6 years. Even if his authority survived his physical decline, authority of that kind was a private monopoly, concentrated in one man, answerable to no public institution, legitimized by nothing more durable than reputation and the particular fear that his presence produced. Aldrich commissioned what became the National Monetary Commission, 2 years of investigation, 23 published volumes of research on central banking systems across Europe, and eventually a framework that wound its way, through the legislative compromises that produced the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, into the institution that now sits at the center of American monetary policy. 23 volumes, 6 years. All of it, in some direct sense, downstream from 3 hours on the morning of October 22nd. The men who designed the Federal Reserve were not, primarily, motivated by the memory of what had gone wrong in 1907. They were motivated, at least in part, by the memory of what had gone right, and the specific, durable problem that a private rescue revealed. Paul Warburg, the Hamburg-born banker whose advocacy was arguably more influential than any other single figures in shaping the Federal Reserve structure, wrote in his 1930 memoir that the fundamental issue was not the panic itself, but the system that had made the panic resolvable only through private fiat. The reform was a response to competence, not to failure. That distinction was not lost on the men writing the legislation. The congressional hearings that followed the panic produced a document the historical literature has not been kind to, the Aldrich Plan, which proposed a Central Reserve Association too obviously controlled by private bankers to survive the populist politics of the progressive era. It did not become law. But the Pujo committee hearings of 1912, which interrogated Morgan directly about the concentration of financial power in the United States, produced something more lasting than legislation. They produced a transcript. Samuel Untermeyer, the Pujo Committee's counsel, asked Morgan a question that has been cited in virtually every account of the 1907 crisis since. He asked whether commercial credit was extended primarily on the basis of money or property. Morgan said it was not. Untermeyer asked what it was based on. Morgan said, character. That word, character, was for Morgan an entirely sincere answer. It was also, for the reformers who read the transcript, the most damning possible description of a financial system. A system in which credit allocation depended on the personal judgment of a single aging banker about the character of his peers was not a system at all. It was a court, and courts require kings. That word, character, spoken before the Pujo Committee in December 1912, landed in newspapers the following morning. Morgan died in Rome 4 months later, in March 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in December of the same year. 3 events in 13 months, each one, in its way, a verdict on the same question. The historical record does not draw a clean causal arrow between Morgan's death and the Fed's creation. The legislative timeline does not permit that reading. What the record does show is that the 2 events arrived in the same year, and that everyone in Congress understood what they meant together. The private lender of last resort was gone. The public one had better be ready. What the crisis foreclosed was not just a method of rescue. It foreclosed the possibility of treating systemic financial stability as a private virtue. Regulation, in this case, was not the response to failure. It was the response to success, to proof that the existing arrangement could only hold for as long as one man's hands were strong enough to hold it. In 1913, those hands were gone. The question of what replaced them would occupy the next century. The next episode in this series takes that question to its first concrete answer. The specific clause inside the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 that its own authors admitted, in private correspondence, they had copied almost word for word from the Morgan Rescue Playbook of 1907. That is the panic of 1907. If this got you, the next episode on this channel is about the night the Bank of England lost control of the pound, and what George Soros had to do with it.